I hear the sounds of your heartbeat. I can hear it now. I can hear it now. I hear the sounds of your heartbeat. I can hear it now. I can hear it now. I hear the sounds of your heartbeat. I can hear it now. I can hear it now.
All right, so for this evening, we've got Sean Newman from Sean Newman Podcast. We've got Marty Up North as Marty Up North, and special guest this evening, we've got Eva Chipiuk, who's been amazing throughout the scamdemic and in her legal battles questioning Justin Trudeau. And right now, she's going to bring in some updates from her work with Jeff Rath, who'll be joining kind of intermittently through audio and video as he can. He's currently in Ontario, so he's a couple hours behind us, but we're hoping to get him in for a good portion of the conversation. So I want to thank all of you for hopping into the conversation. And as agreed upon, I'm going to say it, we're going to have one fuck of a great time here. So, hey man, I promise.
Should I crack a beer? Should I go get a beer? Is that kind of the fun time we're going to have?
This is serious business.
This is serious business. So, Eva, you and Rath and Company, Jeff Rath, are working on a class action, actually two class action lawsuits against the province of Alberta. So to make sure that's very specific. But also, what I want to do is let's maybe cover off the one that you guys haven't filed for certification on. Then we'll hop into, and that's the vaccine injury one. And then we'll hop into the current one that you've got. So take it away on the class action for the vaccine injured that you guys are working on certification for. And the reason that I want you to do this, and the reason I think it's so important, is because I want to make sure that there is as many Albertans as possible who have been injured or who have been impacted by the province in their legislation or through their mandates to either get the jabs, or who've had their businesses closed down or, suffered financial losses, to be a part of these things, as much as possible. So take it away, Eva.
Okay, so that was a lot there. And you want me to start with the vaccine class action?
Let's do that. And then, kind of what you think for a timeline on that. And then we'll hop into other stuff. And actually, I've got Jeff Rath, who's hopping into the conversation. Hey, welcome aboard, Jeff. Thanks for taking the time.
I didn't even get one word in yet, so.
Well, there you go.
Won't happen now. Just
nice
kidding.
That I'm not here and that you were allowed to talk. That's good. Sorry.
Well, I'll just let you know, Sheldon was asking us to provide a quick update on the vaccine class action first, and then get really into.
Sure. So why don't you start with that, Eva?
Sure. So just to clarify, one thing is on the vaccine class action, there is a little bit different with the defendants. We had sued both the federal government and the provincial government on the vaccine class action. In the business class action, it was only the province, and we'll get into all of that, I hope, and I'm sure, when we talk about the business one. But why I think it's really important to highlight the two defendants on the vaccine class action is that we made some, I think, very interesting allegations, including that there was coordinated effort by both the federal government elected officials and public health officials, as well as provincially. So there was that coordination. And what's interesting is that just very recently, I don't know if you heard, that in BC, there's a class action started that's suing both the federal government and the provincial government on the safe supply. And some of the wording is very similar to ours in that it was the government representing that the vaccines were safe, and it's very similar to the safe supply in BC. So I just wanted to throw that out there. As for a quick update on that one, we had our first case management hearing on Tuesday of last week. Our justice is Nancy Diltz, and we have our application due for notification of certification. So we're asking the court to certify this as a class action. And another thing that we are doing for September 13th is our deadline on these two things, is we've asked the federal government to provide unredacted vaccine contracts. And they said they're objecting to it at this stage. So we have to make an application to the court for those documents.
Eva, can you just expand a little bit on the whole certification concept?
Yeah.
Like, there's people who are listening who might not be entirely familiar with that. You know, people assume that a class action is an automatic thing, you know, that you just launch one, but explain a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's good foundation for both. And then Jeff, jump in anytime you want here. But what's interesting in Alberta is it's an opt-out province. So we've described a class of people in Alberta that we believe are represented in these two. So on one, it's on the business, and one, it's vaccine injury. As it stands right now, we actually represent everybody in Alberta that would fall under that definition. So what happens is we're going to court, asking the court to certify this as a class action. You have representative plaintiffs, so those are the ones named, and then anybody else that would meet that definition, if the court grants it, they're already part of it. What they have to do, because it's an opt-out province, they would have to notify our office saying, okay, we heard you got certification, and we're going to get our own lawyer or something like that. But currently, we actually represent all Albertans that would qualify. I don't know if, Jeff, you had anything else to add to the process.
There are a few issues I'll jump in on in a minute.
Sure. Did that explain it pretty well?
Yeah, it does. So, in the case of the vaccine injury, the representative plaintiff in that case is
Carrie Sakamoto.
It's just one person. It's Carrie, and then in the new one you're launching now, there's two plaintiffs, right? There's
well, that one, just to be
that
clear,
one's actually older.
The new one we're
that
launching
one's
now.
older. Okay, sorry.
The business class action preceded the vaccine class.
Yeah.
That's why we're a few steps ahead. So the document that we just made public, I think earlier last week, is the brief. So we're already a few steps ahead on that one, and that was the substantive argument and case law to support our request from the court to certify it. And why you want a certification, why the court wants one, is a few reasons. Is if hundreds of people went to court asking for the same, all saying, okay, the government shut us down, and because of the government shutdown, I am looking for losses, the court would be inundated. It already is. And so that's the whole purpose of the class action. It's also easier access to justice instead of each person having to go. And the last thing, which I think is important for when governments are the defendants, is it's meant to modify their behavior. And that's something I know all of you guys have talked about before is, you don't often sue the government officials personally, and lots of people kind of want that to happen. Practically, it's not the best way to go forward because there's lots of immunity that these individuals have. But with respect to a class action, governments will have to take note that, this is a big class, and a lot of people were affected, and they're seeking justice through the courts. And so it will modify behavior, I believe, ultimately, which is something that I think.
And I think a big part of this, if I can interrupt just for a quick sec, is that it turns into be a more efficient process. So as an example, let's say you have 150 people that want to sue the government at the same time, but only 12 of those people can actually afford legal fees. So the idea behind a class action is to make it a more fair process for people that are limited in funds, but also works to expedite it in that they're not all battling under the same banner. And then where this kind of gets a little bit deeper, and I believe it was through the accounting that Jeff had presented some information on questioning with I think it was Cotton. In how do we take a class action, and then how do we, make sure that funds are available for everybody, depending on the level of businesses that they have. So taking this from like a very large standpoint, I mean, you've got two initial people that have signed up. So they're the primaries on this thing. Whistleblower stop, the truck stop, and then the Ingram Gym.
It's
And
actually the whistle stop. I like
Whistle Stop. Whistle Stop.
Whistle Stop Cafe and Rebecca Ingram.
You should change it.
Christopher
Man,
Scott
I've read through this thing a couple times, and I know Chris. I've met him on a few occasions, so I'm sorry that I botched that one. But Whistleblower actually sounds better because that's really where we're at right now. So the idea is that they run two very different businesses in two very distinct locations. Mirror, Alberta has a population of like 12 people, but it's like everybody in the surrounding areas. And I'm kidding on the 12 people. I know Mirror has a lot more people.
No, it's 14. It's 14.
Yeah,
Sorry.
two must have moved in the last week, I guess.
Yeah.
Whereas Ingram is actually in the city of Calgary. So, not to take away and say that, Ingram has more clients, or they're just different business structures. So we have, a restaurant, somebody that had a drive-in screen, gas bar, and confectionery, I believe, is all of what Whistle Stop has, versus the retail business and gym that Ingram has. So when you're looking at the broadest stream of these things, and again, I'm just trying to clear this up from my own perspective, is that there's going to be a lot more people that are going to be getting involved with this, with businesses of varying sizes. So one of the things that the class action helps to do is helps to make sure that there's different levels of, what these people can actually hope to get by way of justice and financial remuneration, as well as make it so that it's more affordable, more cost effective, and more timely in all these cases. Did I get most of that correct?
You've nailed it. But the other thing to keep in mind is that even though we're going with Chris, who's a restaurant owner and a restaurant operator, and Rebecca, a gym owner, the certification of the class that we're seeking is for any business owner in Alberta who suffered as a result of all of the illegal Hinshaw lockdown orders. So, hair salons, personal services businesses, as an example, I was talking to a physiotherapist the other day, and I just asked him, I said, hey, off the top of your head, how much did you lose when you were shut down for 6 weeks? And he said, oh, that's easy. He said, 6 weeks, 25,000 a week, 150 grand. Right. And he could do the calculation that quickly. I know a large dental business in Calgary, where their losses for 6 weeks were a couple million. I know a restaurateur who has a chain of restaurants in northern Alberta. His losses are over 12 million. So it's not a one size fits all thing, and we're going to have to come up with a formula. Working with our economists to allow people to basically apply to the court in a very simplified, stripped down way once liability is established, to get to have to prove their damages. But the damages we're talking about are extremely substantial. We're talking this is a multi-billion-dollar claim on the business side. So that's what people need to keep in mind, is that in assessing whether you're a potential plaintiff in this action, did you own a business or have an interest in a business that lost money as a result of lost revenue being taken away as a result of these illegal shutdown orders? And again, it could be any type of business, whether it's a nail salon, a hair salon, a physiotherapist business, a dentist business, a mom and pop grocery store.
Actually,
you name it. What's that?
No, you're making me think, Jeff. I wonder if anybody's done sort of. I think it's been done at the federal level, but what was the cost of COVID? I mean, it's probably a number we could probably. Or Eva's smirking. I think we could probably quantify almost the size of the impact, right?
One of the despicable things about this, Marty, is that and this has come out in our cross-examination of the government witnesses, is that the bureaucrats took really good care of themselves during COVID. You know, like they voted themselves or got the government to give various levels of government and government bureaucracy, whether it's municipalities or whoever, all these various government departments had their hands out for over $13 billion in new COVID funds through COVID to offset what they saw as their costs and damages arising from COVID and the impact of all these orders on them.
Yeah, but
Interesting that the businesses that are the backbone of this province were only allocated by these same bureaucrats who had their hands out, were only allocated between 6 and 700,000 or 6 or 700 million. I'm sorry, and we're not sure whether it's 6 million or 600 million or 700 million because the woman from Treasury Board who's in charge doesn't know. So,
yeah, no,
but what's 100 million here or there?
No. What I was saying is, you know, there are ways to figure out the cost. I mean, I know, for instance, like the government of Alberta has, you know, an economic dashboard, and they publish incredible amounts of data. So I can go on there right now, and I can tell you that, for instance, restaurant sales during COVID dropped by about, you know, $350 million. I mean, you could literally see the sales and then it dropped. So I could use that as a proxy and say the restaurant industry and small restaurant owners in Alberta lost $350 million.
Well, I think
I can see the tourism numbers, the hotel. No, I'm just giving one example.
Okay.
If I add them all up,
yeah, actual number that came off of their dashboard.
Yeah, if I add them all up, the small businesses in Alberta probably took a multi-billion-dollar hit, like you suggested.
Yeah, if I add them all.
Well, I mean, if you're a business in Alberta through COVID and your name isn't Walmart or several others or a liquor store or maybe a weed joint, you were hurt immensely. So what I'm taking from Jeff and Eva is if you're sitting in Alberta right now and you're a business owner and you went through COVID, you should be reaching out. And forgive me if I'm making that too simple or if I've missed anything, but if you're sitting in Alberta and you're a business owner, chances are you went through some tough times. You can get in on this, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, our website is rathandcompany.com, and it's the business class, you know, the business class action, COVID business class action tab that you go to. And what we're asking people to do, and again, they don't need to quote unquote sign up at this stage, and they're not committing to anything by providing us, you know, their information at this stage. But what we're trying to do is to gather as much information as we can from people to try to get a handle on what these damages are. Right. So we're asking people to, you know, provide us their basic information, what their estimates are of their losses. Right. So that we can get a handle, you know, overall of the magnitude of this thing. My sense of it is that it's, you know, that it's over $10 billion. But again, you know, the more we can hone that down and the more, you know, the more accurate numbers that we can provide to our economists, the better on a going forward basis. The other thing that we're doing as well is we're seeking, you know, we're pursuing a claim for aggregate damages on the, you know, on the theory that, you know, that there's, you know, kind of like with the residential school settlement, you had this common experience payment. So, you know, what we want to do is to go after, you know, sort of a common damages payment. They can say that everybody suffered at a base level so that we, you know, money can get out to people sooner, you know, rather than later through this process, with then individual businesses being able to come in with their individual and actual calculations, because obviously, you know, some businesses, you know, have been hurt a lot more than others. You know, and in certain cases that I'm well aware of, where business owners, you know, were actually driven to suicide, you know, by these ridiculous lockdown orders that were imposed.
Now, here's a question for you, and because I really don't have an idea as how they'd actually scope into this. Now, I know you're only working with the two cases, you know, initially, and you know, I don't want to comment on other people that might have signed up for this. But if you look at it's Allison Ingram, correct?
No, it's Rebecca Ingram.
Rebecca, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've met her too. I'm terrible with names. So for Rebecca, she didn't lose her home. She had to sell her home to keep her business afloat. And I'm guessing that was probably somewhere around 2021 when the market on housing was basically bottoming out, right? So there wasn't a lot of people house shopping during all the lockdown stuff. So she would have had to have sold her house at, a large loss in addition to when she'd sold her business. But if we look at the housing market right now, the housing market's booming. Because of the Calgary market, prices are inflated. How do they look to adjust for the values of, what the market was when she had to sell versus what the market looks like right now if she could rebuy?
Well, those are certainly things that we'd have our economists looking at, on a going forward basis, right? Because I mean, those are all things by and large that would fall within under the heading of economic loss, right? So that's certainly a great thought, and that's certainly something that we'd be looking at.
And in addition to that, and I know you're probably going to say the same thing here, both of you, is that, I mean, you've talked about, people that have lost up to $12 million, but you're not only handling the $12 million people throughout the class action. It's also for the people that, may have lost 5 to 10,000 or 2 to 3,000 per month, whatever they can rationalize or they can actually show and manage, right? Like you're not cutting this off.
Oh no,
no.
And again, like let's look at somebody that had an at-home aesthetics business or whatever that was making $5,000 or $6,000 a month, right? I mean, their revenue losses right off the top, for the 6 weeks that they weren't allowed to, they weren't legally allowed to provide services to people in their home, would be roughly $8,000. Just doing the math on that, and then you have to look at all the associated losses with that, and then what did that do to their life, from an economic perspective, by having that $8,000 hole punched in the middle of their finances when they're living from when they're living from month to month, and so on. I mean, what else did they lose as a result of that? Were they unable to make their car payments? Did they lose their car? Did they lose their apartment? Did they lose their credit rating? Did they lose their home? All of those things have to be looked at on an individual basis, and everybody's losses are different. Not every business is different. Some people have nice little businesses that generate $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $10,000 a month that provide them a very good standard of living. They're absolutely every bit as important to us as the people that lost millions. So yeah, I'm really happy you brought that up, because that's certainly we're in this for everybody that suffered as a result of these illegal orders, and that's one of the other getting back to the one of the reasons that you do class actions. Those people that with those lower levels of losses, there's no way on earth that anybody with a $10,000 or $15,000 loss would be able to go out and hire a lawyer, go to court,
against the government,
pursue their remedies. With legal counsel outside of small claims court on a $10,000 claim, right?
And against the government, who is great at putting up obstacles and hurdles on every lawsuit that goes before them.
Oh, I mean, yeah, we heard, this is just jumping back to the vaccine class action for a second. We heard from a federal lawyer the other day that with regard to the vaccines, that the federal government did not owe Canadians a duty of care. Like, think about that for a minute. No duty of care with regard to these vaccines that they repeatedly said were safe and effective, which we were mandated to take. And if we didn't take them, we had our civil rights, including our mobility rights, stripped away. But the government had no duty of care. And that's going to be that's their first step into the ring, or the first blow they're trying to land in the vaccine class action case. So that's, when you're litigating with governments, it's this kind of nonsense that you're dealing with, on an ongoing basis. And keep in mind, our tax dollars are paying for people to go into court and say that the federal government had no duty of care with regard to these vaccines that have harmed so many people across this country.
Yes, I like where you went with that, because I wanted to focus a bit on the actual, what we're claiming in this brief, because I think it's so important for Albertans to hear it as well. And it really sets out what the government did, because the thing that Jeff was talking about a moment ago, whether or not there's a duty of care, that's like, the proximity of whether what the government did, if there's a direct relationship to the person, and whether damages flow. So in this case, I hope you're all familiar with the Ingram decision. It's already said that these public health orders are illegal because they didn't go through the proper channel. And so we were actually, I think most of us were at that town hall with Danielle Smith a few weeks ago, and she mentioned the Alberta Bill of Rights, excuse me. And that's our first cause of action in this claim, is because under the Bill of Rights, it says that you can't take somebody's property in Alberta without due process. And she alluded to her plan to expand on it. But as I just explained with the Ingram decision that's already been passed, it found that those health orders didn't go through proper process. And so it's
more than that, it found that they were illegal. They were ultra vires the Public Health Act. So, importantly, with the business class action, from our perspective, liability has largely been established, because what you're dealing with here is a situation where everything that was done by the government from the outset was illegal, right? So what we had, this is, again, following along from the Ingram decision, what we had was a situation where Jason Kenney, Tyler Shandro, Jason Copping, and the whole cocktail cabinet, didn't want their fingerprints on any of the orders or the decisions that were made for political reasons. So legally, they could have made all of those decisions under the Emergencies Act. Had they done it, though, one would have hoped there would have been a different process, and it wouldn't have been so health focused, which led to all the horrible decision making that was made. And they would have taken a whole of government look at this and actually considered the impact on the economy before making the ridiculous decisions that were made. But Kenney and company didn't want their fingerprints on this. So rather than doing things legally through the Public Health Act, they just told Dina Hinshaw came in with a cocktail list, or cocktail menu of options for them to consider. And they would just pick one off the list. Invariably, what we think is they picked the one in the middle. So for all we know, some of the options could have been, do nothing, increase public education, really stress to people, the importance of staying home and doing all these things we, advise at one end. And then, at the far end, to make all the Karens happy, lock everybody up in their homes. And then there was something in the middle. And I think invariably what happened was that Kenney and company picked the one in the middle every time, because they were afraid if they went with the zero or no restriction option, which was available to them, they would make everybody, all the hardcore Karens really unhappy with them. And if they went with the, lock everybody down in their homes forever, don't let anybody out of their houses, impose restrictions like they're imposing in Australia, then, everybody that lives in rural Alberta and has any common sense would be, driving to Edmonton with pickup trucks and pitchforks. So what they did was, I say that they accomplished the rarest of all political feats by going right down the middle on this issue. They angered everybody on both sides of the equation equally, infuriated everybody equally on both sides of the issue. The hardcore Karens that wanted the full Australian lockdown on the far left, and then obviously infuriated all of us with any degree of common sense that knew that all of these measures were just complete nonsense. So that's what we're dealing with. But then what they said was, rather than taking ownership of that and say, this was our political decision, we made it. Oh no, we're just following doctors' orders. We're just following doctors' orders, right? And of course, what I pointed out in court, and I have to say Justice Romaine wasn't very happy with this argument. But, I literally said in court, I said, this is like a surgeon performing surgery. This is Hinshaw pretending that she's everybody's doctor and, is acting on all of our best interests. A surgeon performing surgery and going to the nurse going, wait a minute, before I close, I better phone the premier and have the premier tell me how he wants me to finish off this procedure on the basis of whether this patient's on his enemies list or not, and whether he wants this patient to live or die, right? That's in essence what Hinshaw was doing, was playing this silly game where, she would go in with her quote unquote medical advice, and then just and then just take whatever order Kenny gave her as to how she was supposed to be practicing medicine. So that's what we were dealing with, and that's why ultimately the court had to find that all of these orders that were issued were ultra vires the Public Health Act, because the Public Health Act was based on is based on a structure wherein the decisions are supposed to be medical decisions, not political decisions, made by politicians that are trying to get reelected.
And a big part of this, and I'm going to go back to the original case with Ingram. There's a piece of information that you guys had released throughout this, where it stated all these different ways and the messaging that they were going to promote through COVID on the lockdowns. And it, they had this grid, and it said, that they're basically going to have to target conservatives with the message more specifically. They went through all these studies that found, mild to moderate or some absolutely no support on it. I'll post it on my Substack with this because it's a really interesting document. But the bottom line of it is that they were working with something that was called a behavioral change wheel. Do you remember that from the case, Jeff? Or was that?
No, I have to say we went through so many hundreds of thousands of pages of paper, most of it ludicrous, that I actually forgot that. If you want to email that to me, I wouldn't mind refreshing my memory and taking a look at it again.
Well, yeah, because when you went through it, what they did is they basically designed, a way they were going to come up with the marketing, and it literally was a marketing program, but it was going to be specific. They said, the liberal voters and NDP are going to be pretty much aligned with the messaging. They're not going to be too bad. But if you find young white conservatives, they're going to buck the message. We're going to have to drive it home a little bit harder. We're going to use these things called the behavioral change wheel. It was incredible. And I think it was in the same document, or it might have been one of the other documents that they had. If everybody can remember back this far, and I mean, it seems like a million years ago over the last 5 years, they'd even made provisions inside of some of their acts to allow for Black Lives Matter protests, because the public had to, be able to get out and voice themselves. Whereas when it came to protests against the government, or something like the Calgary Stampede or Edmonton Klondike Days, no, you weren't allowed to be in large groups for those. It was very specific. It has to be a supported protest. It was so stupid. I'll send you over the document. Sorry, I didn't want to hoard that. The other thing too is you keep talking about a 6-week period. Is there a select 6 weeks inside of the pandemic that you guys are able to sue for, or is this throughout the entire lockdown process?
With regard to all of the lockdown orders generally, but there was a period where there was a hard shutdown on certain businesses that was 6 weeks long, right? So personal services business, physiotherapists, those types of things. There was a hard shutdown where those businesses flat out lost 6 weeks of revenue, right? Those particular businesses. Other businesses, they had longer shutdown periods, right? It all depended on the type of business. And then some businesses, it was partial shutdowns. And then with restaurants, you've got the added issue of, okay, we're reopening, get everything restocked. And then they run out and they buy all their food and they restock everything. And then they're told that everything that they just bought that they intended to serve fresh now can all be thrown out because they were shut down the next week before they could use any of their fresh produce, right? So there's different types of losses, the whole way through. And then obviously some restaurants that were, easier to adapt to, takeout, may have actually done better during COVID as a result. Well, competitors, operating restaurants, that were geared towards, a sit-down dining experience, obviously suffered, even more, right? So, so there's there's going to be a certain element of uniqueness to how we're going to be calculating the damages on a business by business or business type by business type basis for sure.
Okay, because that's what I just wanted to qualify is where that 6 week period was, because I know even throughout the vaccine mandates, when some businesses had to request your passport or your arrive scam, whatever, your proof of vaccination, or you had to get a test that was done in order to be able to be in those. And there were guys like Nenshi that came out and said, well, you know, these businesses requested it and it's actually better for business. But all the businesses that I talked to throughout those periods said, no, when you eliminate, you know, whatever it will look like, a quarter of the, you know, your clientele, your business wasn't getting back up to the same levels it was. And I mean, those extended into 2023.
No, for sure. And I mean, and yeah, and a lot of people, you know, obviously just changed their habits. It's like, you know, ask me for a QR code. Well, I guess I'll never be coming here again. Right. And I think there were a lot of us that felt that way. Right. I mean, this week I'm actually, I'm joining you people from a secret bunker deep in the heart of Ottawa tonight, but I'm here on a family vacation.
You people?
But that's the, this is the first domestic flight I've taken since the start of COVID. You know, and
Really?
prior to COVID, I was a 3 million mile Air Canada, condolences to me, but I was a 3 million mile Air Canada flyer. You know, and I barely fly anymore just because I still can't, I still think I have a little bit of PTSD from, you know, having my rights to fly stripped by the government. Like, you know, we're not allowed on airplanes, we're not allowed in restaurants, we're not allowed, you know, all these places that we're not allowed to go because we wouldn't accede to the government demand that we inject ourselves with poison.
I'm just curious, and having two lawyers on here is beautiful because I sit on the border, Jeff, Eva, you probably know that by now, in Lloydminster, right? So I got a ton of people who listen from just across into Saskatchewan. Knowing this is an Alberta class action, is it is this something, if you're a Saskatchewan, you know, on and on it goes, BC, Manitoba, et cetera, is this something that can happen elsewhere, or is it specific to Alberta with what's going on here, specifically with Ingram and everything else?
Well, the claims with regard to Ingram are Alberta specific because it's the Alberta orders that were declared ultra vires. I think we're the only lawyers our firm is the only lawyers in Canada that succeeded in making that argument in any province in the country. So, you know, and that's not to say that I don't think the same argument could have been made elsewhere. It just wasn't. So, you know, Albertans are in a fairly unique and lucky position, you know, all thanks to, you know, Jason Kenney's craven nature and cowardice and his unwillingness to actually put his name to the things that he was doing to people. Right. So, you know, if there's any silver lining that came out of COVID, you know, it's that. And I guess to that extent, karma's a bit of a bitch, you know, so.
So there is actually another longstanding case that's been going on in BC, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to post this in chat if people want to kind of check it out. And it's SueBonnie.ca, so SUE as in lawsuit, Bonnie.ca as in Queen Bonnie, you know, Bonnie Henry out in BC. And I have talked to some other people where they have mentioned that you know, they're working with other lawyers that have been trying to get a class action certification since the masking actually was introduced. Reason being is they didn't feel that this was proper, but because of BC being BC, is they have a lot harder time with certification. Now, I didn't actually get a chance to go over this, but it is actually going on in other provinces. So that's the only other one that somebody's made me aware of, but you know, just have it out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? So regardless, so it's a class action. There's this whole class action component to it, but for the time being, it is still just a lawsuit of two plaintiffs against the government, correct? Like that's what's going to be argued in court. Now, and what you're saying is the more people you collect behind the scenes in this class action, the more clout, I guess, it gives to your lawsuit. But does it change the dynamic? Do you think the government, like, could you get too big to the point where the government will throw everything at you to fight you? Is there a number? Like, would you want to be, let's say, smaller?
No, I think the government knows it's a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. And let's face it, there's no way to make this thing smaller, right?
Right.
Because, you know, ultimately, you know, and then there's another issue too, is that if we hadn't brought this as a class action, and if we don't succeed in certification, there's a whole bunch of people in Alberta that may have had a claim that are going to be out of time. They're going to be time barred, right? So, we're proceeding forward on behalf of, two litigants who do not have limitations issues. We are, seeking to have liability for damages established. And we think that the case law, in that regard is extreme, is very strong. I mean, we've got cases like Ron Corelli and Duplessis and others that all basically say that where a government conducts itself illegally and causes economic losses, that those economic losses are compensable in damages. And it's not just the Bill of Rights. I mean, that's just under, good old fashioned, Canadian law, dating back to the 1950s, right? Where, the courts were very firm to say that, if a government exceeds, and that was basically the claim was excessive authority, right? If a government acts without authority to do something and causes economic harm, that action is compensable in damages, right? So, and the interesting thing about this, and this is what we want everybody to be really clear on with the business class action, is we're not even going to be arguing that what the government did was for an improper motive, and we're not going to be arguing that what they did, wasn't necessary, right? Because we don't need to do that to win, right? All we have to show is that they acted illegally and they caused harm. So this whole, it was COVID and, senior citizens were dying and people were dying and, we had to act. And even though we were wrong, it was an emergency. And we, try to create that whole, emergency management exception. We all need to be forgiven, because even though we acted idiotically with the best of intentions, whatever. But when you break it down this way, and that is, we don't care about that. Like, we don't care why you did it. We don't even care that what you did was idiotic. What you did was illegal, right? And because what you did was illegal, right? It's by definition, and what you did was illegal, caused harm, right? And it was intended to cause harm. You intended to close those businesses down. You knew that was going to cause was going to harm people economically. You said you were doing it for the public good. So on what theory, where you act, in a bona fide manner for the public good, should the public good or the public not be compensating that smaller segment of society that was being harmed for the good of the public as a whole, right? I mean, it's just, it's like the whole, it's basically the concept behind, expropriation law. Sure, we all want new highways and ring roads, and we don't want to be stuck in traffic jams and the rest of it. So unfortunately, from time to time, a citizen's house is in the way. If their house has to be bulldozed for the public good, a new 5-lane highway, so we don't, we're not all stuck in traffic all the time. Well, the government has an obligation to compensate that person whose property is being taken for the public good. Well, it's the same thing here. Only what happened was the Kenney government and Taves and all of those characters in Treasury Board in Alberta decided, we're going to kick the crap out of all of these people economically, and we're just going to scurry around in the shadows when we do it. And hopefully we'll never have to pay for it. We'll throw out little small amounts of money. We'll bring in some sort of grant program, and we'll throw out $5,000 here and $20,000 there, and all these small amounts of money that in no way made anybody who was harmed whole, right? And they knew they weren't making people whole, right? And I know that for a fact. I cross-examined Treasury Board officials actually in that case that I was that doctor's case that I was doing some time ago, and they all admitted that, we knew that we weren't fully compensating people, and we knew we weren't making people whole. That was never the intention, right? So, and it seems to me that the Taves Finance Department and all these people in Treasury Board had this messed up idea that they were somehow creating their own weird little stress test for businesses in Alberta. And the idea being, if you don't survive this, you weren't much of a business anyway. It's this level of government arrogance that can only come from a bureaucrat on a provincial government salary for life that, never has to worry a day about where his next paycheck is coming from, that we're making these decisions, and that's what we're dealing with.
If I don't hop in here for Eva, I don't know. I see you chomping at the bit. Eva,
Well, thanks, because I wanted to touch on what Jeff was saying a while back, because I think it's so incredibly important. It's the abuse of power. And Jeff, you kind of threw it out there, the Ron Corelli and Duplessis case, but I don't think many Canadians or Albertans know about it. And I think it's incredibly important to highlight it, because it's pretty much what we're dealing with. So that was like Jeff said, like 1940s. And the premier, Duplessis, the plaintiff was Ron Corelli, and he was a restaurant owner, and he was a Jehovah's Witness, and he was helping bail people out that were distributing pamphlets that at the time in Quebec the Roman Catholic Church and establishment didn't like. So they were actually getting charged and taken to jail. So, they didn't like the message. They didn't like the challenge of the government. And this guy, Ron Corelli, was bailing them out. And he was doing that for quite a while. And then all of a sudden, the premier got a hold of that. And he's like, we need to stop that. And he told the liquor board to remove that guy's, Ron Corelli's liquor license for his restaurant. It was a long-term, well-known establishment. And he just did it to quiet him down. And I just think that these cases are important to highlight, because this is, so indicative of what we've been seeing lately too, overstep of power. And then the other case we refer to is that very recent Supreme Court case, Power, that also talked about abuse of power. So I just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of case law supporting this as well. Since 1940 even. Obviously, you can't overstep, but we've kind of seen governments try to shield themselves from all these kind of actions. And it's like, okay, at one point, you have to take responsibility for the things that you're doing. You can't just do whatever. So I wanted to highlight those cases.
So on that, Eva, is that a part of the brief that you guys had put out? Because somebody in the comments is asking, where are the information for the court cases being referenced? So I put up the link to the brief that you have, and it's when anybody had a look at this thing, you'd seen it was a 101-page PDF, but it's not that intimidating, and it's actually a really good read. You can get through it, and if you read fast in a couple short hours, and it's actually really entertaining. I've followed Jeff in the Ingram case. I mean, it's like he does a really amazing job, and you get to that in the last sections of it. So it's
You
worth
could
the
get
read.
through it in a couple hours. Marty's face was perfect. Me and
Yeah,
him
an
looked at each other, we're like,
entertaining brief like this.
I've read a
I
lot of
think
those.
it's entertaining.
No, it was. I thought it was entertaining.
I thought
It's only 55 pages of
I'm
PDF.
gonna send you a control narrative from one of my projects back in the days. Let's see what's more entertaining. I'm kidding.
No, so if that's where they're referenced, the other 45 pages or 46 pages of the 101-page document are the references that you guys have, and I believe they are hyperlinked. I didn't go through the hyperlinks. I've just seen it. And then there's a couple of tabs that kind of roll out a little bit more information on the actual class action case law, I believe.
Yeah, and just to jump in, there's a great quote in Ron Corelli that's referenced in that brief that literally says, even if what Duplessis was doing to Ron Corelli, right, was for a bona fide public purpose, right, it didn't matter. He didn't have the authority to do it. And even if it was for the best of reasons with the best of intentions, as long as it was outside of the law, they had to pay compensation. And that's what this case is about.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Just going back to the brief so that maybe Marty will want to read it more, about half or at least a third of it is also direct evidence from the defendants. And I think it's really interesting, some of the information and the evidence they were providing. We highlighted some of it, but $100 million discrepancy by the top, person at the Treasury Board is not very comforting, nor should it be to Albertans. And I think Albertans should know that and understand that that's something that's going on.
What is the forgive me, I don't understand all the legal processes and everything going on. I heard certification a while back. Is this not a slam dunk, but is this like, oh, we're ready and we're walking through and we're very confident, or is this like the next couple months are pretty turbulent and we need to make sure the pressure's on and we got to get through a couple hoops? Like, where are we at in the process? And for Albertans or anyone else watching this, like, what is the next month, or is it like 6 months? What's the time frame? What does that look like? Should there be things we're paying attention to?
Well, I could answer in terms of the next step is the defendant. So the province is doing a reply to our brief, and that's due September 13th. We have 2 weeks to respond. And then Jeff and I will be in court with the province on October 2nd and 3rd, and we're going to be arguing. So the whole argument is about whether or not this should be certified as a class action. And so far, the province has said it shouldn't be, so they're defending it. They could have agreed and just said, yeah, it makes sense that all these people, and then we would still have to argue whether or not there is that relationship and whether or not the government has to compensate these people. But we're just talking about the process so far. So it is a little bit, I think, surprising that the province is going through these hoops. Sheldon mentioned in a text message, and we didn't get to it yet, one of the experts that was retained to provide expert opinion on the certification had no information or expertise on a certification. So even like, what was the expense and what was the purpose of the province hiring this expert without expertise to do this part? Or, why did the province do that? It kind of doesn't make sense to me.
The other thing too, that when you talk about pressure, right? I mean, the court process is the court process, right? And Eva's a senior barrister. I've been practicing for 34 years. It's improper for either one of us to suggest that any pressure be brought to bear on the court. But where pressure should be brought is that every Albertan should be writing Danielle Smith going, why the hell is your government fighting certification on a case that you should be settling, right? You should be rolling up your sleeves, instructing all the little boys and girls in Treasury Board that thought it was such a great idea to almost murder all of these businesses in this province, to come up with a mechanism to settle this case and to get money in the hands of all of the businesses that were harmed, to fully compensate them for their losses and damages. Because from my perspective, it's completely immoral that the government isn't doing this. Certainly rural Albertans didn't elect Danielle Smith to be continuing to defend Jason Kenney and the policies of Jason Kenney. So, I think people should be reaching out to Danielle Smith and saying, hey, why is it that one segment of Alberta society, specifically small business people, are still being asked to carry the burden of society as a whole through COVID? Why aren't you compensating those people, and why aren't you resolving this issue rather than fighting it?
Yeah,
she has the power. She has the power to settle this case.
And I just wanted to add, now that we have the evidence that $13 billion or so went to the public sector, and we hear support local or best summer ever, and yet now we have the evidence to show that, nothing went to help support these businesses. So now it's all there. It's opened up. The books are open, and businesses, Albertans, should really be asking some hard questions of their elected officials, 100%.
Yeah,
Now,
basically the only thing that businesses got individuals got CERB, and some businesses got something similar to CERB, but those were federal programs, right? There was
there was this small to medium business grant process in Alberta where 45,000 businesses applied for funding as a grant, not a loan, for between $5,000 and $20,000, right? That was made available to small businesses in Alberta. But that money was a drop in the bucket compared to the losses.
Yeah, I'm trying to do the math. 45,000. You said how many businesses? 45,000 businesses got about $25,000 each.
No.
It said 40,000 in the brief.
If they were eligible, right?
Yeah, it's $1 billion bucks.
That's the amount where we had in the evidence of this, the top treasury bureaucrat that was given to us. In one part of her own evidence, it said the grant program gave 650 million around, and in another part of her own evidence, it had over 700 million. And we asked her about it. This is the accountant for Alberta, and she's like, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Now, a big part of this too is now if Smith did go ahead and say, okay, let's go into a settlement, you've got a number of businesses that have signed up, but you have until the end of until this gets certified to still bring more businesses into it, right?
Oh, no. Even after certification.
Okay.
And people are still in. There's going to be a process after certification for advertising, advising people, of the claim, right, and allowing them to opt out. But if you don't opt out, you're in. So everybody who had business losses that fit within the definition of the class would have a claim to damages under the action. They don't have to physically sign up.
And that would be those same 40,000 people that applied for the grant, and that'd be the same.
Well, those are just the people that applied. We know that there's more than 45,000 small business people in Alberta. I mean, small business people are the backbone of our economy. It's probably closer to probably closer to 250,000 people.
One thing I want to mention, because I've heard it and Marty kind of alluded to it, is I've talked to some businesses that said, oh, they didn't have any losses or anything. And I'm like, really? You owned a yoga studio. How did that happen? And she explained that, well, she got a loan from the federal government or her parents. And I'm like, that's a loss to you. So I just wanted to put that out there to the audience, because I don't think they're putting that together, that if the government hadn't shut the businesses down and you didn't have to reach out to other funders to help get you through it, that's a loss. And that those would be the type of losses that we're looking to compensate. So I just want
the grant money coming from Alberta, could be argued by the government to be a set off, right? If somebody got a grant, right? But loan money, a loan is a loan. Like this one restaurateur that has been working with us and having his accountants provide all of his financial information so that we can get a handle on what some of these bigger enterprise losses look like, right? He was saying, look, Jeff, he said, before COVID, he said, I was proud of the fact that I was basically debt free. He said, sure, I had the odd business line of credit for 100,000 or two here or there. But he said, I knew any day of the week, if I wanted to say I was debt free, I could just go right and, go stroke a check for a couple $100,000 and I'd be debt free. But he said, but to keep all of my restaurants going and to keep operating under the environment that the government created, he said, I had no choice but to go out and borrow piles of money to make sure that I didn't lose my restaurants and I didn't lose all my staff and I didn't lose my entire business. And he said, lo and behold, at the end of COVID, he said, I now find that I have a new business partner, specifically my bank, that now owns $12 million worth of my business. So, so this one, restaurant group had to borrow $12 million to keep their restaurants afloat through COVID, thanks to all of these ridiculous lockdown orders. Right? That's one plaintiff.
Yeah.
Now, under the grant thing where everybody applied, if you'd lost your business, were you still able to apply for the grants? Like if you could say to the government, because I know when you'd question them, they couldn't give you the qualifications as to, what was between 5,000 or why they would get 20,000. And that's actually the amusing part. So if you read into the last portion of the 55 pages of the briefing, that's where Jeff clubs some of these expert witnesses harder than Canadian SEALs. Like it's good reading. But the people that lost their businesses before the grants came out, were they able to get some of that grant money back, or are they're just screwed and they have to rely on a class action?
So with the grant program, it was only for a short time, and that was provided also in the evidence, just how much money and for how short of a time. So that's the thing. There was criteria that you had to put in, like how much you were making before up to a certain date, how much you were, and then they assessed it, and the province allocated anywhere between, I think it was $5,000 and $20,000 based on your input. So they came up with some kind of on the fly way of assessing how much they're going to give in that case. Whether or not somebody could apply when their business was gone, I don't recall those exact details, but it was so early on that I don't think anybody was yet losing their businesses. But that would be interesting if somebody lost their business and then the province denied them the couple grand. That could have happened, but I don't know.
There's no winning. I mean, whether you got 5 or 20 grand for losing your business, there would be no winners. But it would be a real slap in the face if you said, "Listen, you know, in the 6 weeks that you've done this, I just opened my business, just taken it over. You completely ruined me financially. Now I can't pay for my home, and you're going to either give me $5,000 or $20,000. Like it is a slap in the face."
Oh, and let's face it, everybody's business model is different, right? So, you know, if your business model is that you're a high-end spa, right? And you need to be located in a very high-end part of town. You have a very high-end clientele. You have very high-end leasehold improvements. You know, everything is just kind of like Bennett Jones law offices. It's all plated in gold, and it's like the first, like you're going the Versailles Palace, right? You know, if your business model supports that, and you're generating, $1 million a month in revenue, off of $100,000 a month, $100,000 a month lease payment, that's not actually bad business, right? But if the cap on your losses, you're going to get shut down, you're going to lose your $1 million a month in revenue, you're not going to be able to afford to pay your $100,000 rent. So at the end of the lockdowns, you're going to be however many, months in the hole. And the government says, "Oh yeah, well, here's your check for $20,000, right?" What does that do for you? It just means that you're marginally less far in the hole, but you're still in a pretty deep hole from what was previously, a very healthy and viable business, right? So, everybody's business is different based on their inputs, based on whatever model they're operating under. And, none of that was taken into account with anything the government did. They didn't care what, people's actual expenses were. They didn't care what their actual, revenues were, whatever. The bureaucrats, again, who get salaries for life, and who've never written a paycheck ever once in their lives, right, were the ones making all these decisions, and they didn't have a clue as to what they were doing.
Well, it was. I mean, it was treated as a health emergency, and we turned to the health experts, where in fact they completely ignored the rest of the economy in the province. I mean, if it was a pandemic, it should have been declared as a provincial emergency, and there should have been experts dealing with all the consequences, not just a narrow-minded group of medical professionals. I think.
But even those so-called medical professionals that we were paying, and all of this is going to come out in different forums, right? But all those so-called medical professionals that we were paying $500,000 a year to for their so-called expertise, at the end of the day, all the evidence that's being uncovered demonstrates that none of them did any critical thinking. None of them applied any critical thought. None of them looked at any, independent studies. They all went, "Oh, well, this is what Theresa Tam told us to do, so that's what we should do," right? So, Dina Hinshaw included. So they're all just slavishly following along all these federal bureaucrats. And I mean, let's face it. I mean, these federal bureaucrats, they're so far out in left field that you don't even know what planet they're on. Like Theresa Tam, I don't know if anybody ever reads my Substack, but she's the woman that says that heteronormativity is one of the biggest causes of climate change, and that we're in the middle of a climate change public health emergency. So I guess Theresa Tam wants to stamp out heteronormativity, and capitalism and ableism in Canada, because all three of those things are big drivers of climate change. These are the people upon whom Dina Hinshaw and all of the rest of her minions in government were relying on for rational guidance and thought.
And in the brief, just to kind of counter on this, and this was also brought up in the Ingram case as well, you'd mentioned that there's the original study that was done. I believe it was Colonel Redmond that was part of it, and he'd actually presented some evidence at that previous trial. where there was a pandemic response. I think it was from 2015. Am I correct on that, Jeff? So
14
we
or
did have
15,
I think 14.
14,
Four-
but yeah.
14 or 15. So it was about
Sure.
6 years prior. So they had this information that was provided in a very conclusive document, definitive and evidence based, that was completely tossed out once COVID hit. They completely ignored that document. And then there was another study, I believe, that you'd taken out of Sweden, also mentioned in the brief, where the impacts they had were almost nothing because they didn't go to the lockdown models.
Well, but again, and to be clear, that document that Colonel Redmond was referring to, the Alberta pandemic preparedness plan, it wasn't a study. This was like, in case of pandemic, break glass. This is your emergency how-to manual that you need to follow to make sure that the impacts of this pandemic are as little as possible on our province. So a lot of people had put years and years and years of work into this plan, right, that was meant to be followed. But then along comes, the WHO and Theresa Tam and Justin Trudeau and all these people. Oh, no, we have to lock down the world. We have to, blah, blah, blah. We need to do this. We need to do that. Blah, 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 blah. No, no rational thought behind it. It's just like, it's just like all these, and that was the one that drove me the battiest, was all the vaccine mandates, right? Because as early as June and July of 2021, Health Canada itself was acknowledging that the vaccines weren't stopping transmission of COVID and weren't stopping people from catching COVID. And then in July of 2021, a big study came out of UC Davis that said that vaccinated people were just as likely, if not more likely, to pass on COVID, right? So the minute all of that stuff came out, all of this garbage that they were doing no longer had any real scientific basis or rationale. If anybody, vaccinated or unvaccinated, right, could catch and pass on COVID, right, there was never any rationale for any of the things that followed from a scientific basis.
And what we'd learned even past that, before the actual vaccine passports were put in through the federal government. So they were put in I believe it was the end of October of 2021. I'll have to check that. But in September, when they shifted the goalposts on, it doesn't stop COVID, but it reduces the viral load. So that's where they shifted to. But there was a document that Noah Chartier from Epoch Times had gotten through Freedom of Information request, showing that they knew that people that were vaccinated had the exact same viral load. So we couldn't show that it stopped cases, and we'd seen this through the heat map graphs that you work with, Jeff. It didn't remove or lower hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and then of course, mortality followed. So I mean, the entire thing was bananas. And not only was it bananas, is that they kept saying things directly in conflict with the information that was actually being provided by everybody that could provide any data or information on it.
Well,
if I can, we're going around here, but I mean, I've thought about this a long time. I made notes because I want to remind myself of what happened in the future. But to me, what happened is COVID hit. There was this weird freaking event that happened in China. Countries around the world reacted. And like you said, I'd love to ask Kenny or whoever, why'd you throw the pandemic plan out the door? Because I mean, in my industry, we have emergency preparedness plans. And when a disaster hits, I pull out that book. But somehow or other, for whatever reason, they threw it out. I think it was because they got swept up into this movement that was happening around the world. And then they started doing these silly things, right? We'll flatten the curve. We'll do 2 weeks and whatever. I swear to God, data came out immediately early on showing that everything was blown out of proportion. But rather than, and politicians being politicians, rather than admitting that everything was already blown out of proportions 3 months into this event, they doubled down. They're like, oh, well, we can't admit it's blown out of proportion. So now we have to have more mandates. And we got so far into the mandates that they're like, the only way out of this now is we need the vaccine. The vaccine came along. The vaccine didn't solve any of the problems. And rather than, again, say the vaccine doesn't work, this is blown out of proportion, We doubled down on the vaccines. We went to multiple doses and this and that. I mean, thank God there was the protests in Ottawa and the truck convoy, because I think it finally, well, actually, some people say that the war in Ukraine ended COVID. And I, in some sense, I think it does. So anyways, I mean, I would argue all those things, but they're all irrelevant, because at the end of the day, it's a matter that through this insanity, politicians hurt people.
Yeah.
And now we need to, and they're still continuing with this insanity. They're not going to admit that they hurt people. So you're going to have to fight it out of them. I mean,
and that's
bit by bit.
In large part, why we're doing this is that we
Yeah.
want to force them to acknowledge that what was done was wrong, right?
Yeah.
We would like, it'll never happen. I mean, our administrative state is so entrenched and are so good at covering for themselves that, we're never going to be able to root all of the real criminals out of the government and make sure that they never work in government again, right? But we'd like to see some form of accountability.
Yeah, like, let me ask you this question. I mean, here's another thought. Like, I thought that if Rachel Notley, for instance, had been in power during COVID and suddenly Danielle Smith came in now, I think there'd be more there. It'd be a different battle, because
there's no doubt about it.
Yeah,
right?
but now it's still Danielle is reluctant to open this can of worms, because in essence, you're going to find people guilty that she associated with. So good luck. You got a tough battle.
That being said, in fairness to Danielle, I know for a fact that Danielle is, still very, very, very involved in getting to the bottom of what went on and has people working on it. And I think there'll be some things released here in the next coming months that, that I can't speak, that I really shouldn't be speaking to. But the problem is all the Kenyites that are left in the government. So it's, ministers that were part of the COVID cabinet, that still want to keep all this under wraps. I'd say the majority of caucus wants all of this out in the open. Look at guys like Eric Bouchard, and I know for a fact, because he's a great guy, and I talk to him on a fairly regular basis. Todd Lowen, who's in cabinet. There's a lot of people out there that want to get to the bottom of this and make sure it never happens again. Danielle's one of them. But you have this big cabal of leftover Kenyites that are doing everything they can to frustrate the entire process and are giving comfort and relief to all the members of the administrative state that don't want to cooperate in internal investigations, that don't want to turn over information, that don't want to provide data, that want to bury data, that want to pretend that none of this happened, right? So that's what's going on. And but here for me, that there's a group of people that a lot of whom I know quite well, who are fighting really hard to get this information out into the public sphere, right?
That's why when I come back to when you clarified pressure, Jeff, I wasn't meaning. I'm glad you clarified that lawyers shouldn't be getting involved in the pressure on the court systems and different things like that. But what you're talking all over again about is what we've been talking about off and on when it comes to Alberta specifically, is where is the pressure best applied by media, by the people, to ensure that, when you're talking a business class action lawsuit, I just think immediately, I think a lot of the people in this room or watching know Drew Weatherhead, right? And his story of shutting down his BJJ gym and then pretty much fleeing the country for 6 months at a time while everything went insanity. So if we can find ways to piece back people together and hold the government account, which is going to be a ridiculous challenge, because as Marty pointed out, if it had been Notley, they would attack it incessantly, but because it's the UCP, they can't attack themselves. So it's an interesting conundrum. But once again, I go back to the pressure of sitting here. Why are we all sitting here? This is something that people need to know about. Alberta businesses need to understand what's going on, that there's an opportunity here to get back some of what they lost. Whether or not that's everything, I mean, that remains for you two to find out and go into the courts. But certainly, when I come back to the pressure thing, it's like, well, what can we do to help? And I think, Jeff, you've brought up multiple points on what people can do.
Yeah, and I think it's important that everybody listening, if you care about holding members of the administrative state accountable, and if you care about helping out your friends and neighbors that had their businesses destroyed during COVID, write Danielle Smith a letter, send her an email saying, why the hell are you fighting certification on the COVID class act, or on the COVID business class action. You need to settle that case. You need to be compensating businesses that were shut down during COVID instead of running away from it, because that's what it looks like right now, is that she's running away from it. And I don't know that she is per se. She's aware of the action, certainly, because it's been brought up to her on a number of occasions. But again, you have all the same people that are constantly trying to keep Danielle from doing the right thing. And again, it's all the Kennyites constantly trying to keep her from doing the right thing by threatening to leave the government, by threatening to start a new political party, by threatening to undermine her leadership, on and on and on. We need to give her the courage to stand up to those people and say, no, I was elected to deal with these issues as a leader, and leaders lead. You mealy-mouthed bastards, I don't want to hear from you anymore, and we're going to sort this out. So, Dennis Modry often talks about Margaret Thatcher. And I mean, that's what we need Danielle to be more of. We need her to be more of the Iron Lady, as opposed to, somebody who's just constantly being browbeaten in the back rooms by all of these misogynistic bullies that are left over from the Kenney government.
Can you refresh my memory? Was Danielle elected at the time of the initial Ingram ruling, or was that still, or did that happen long enough that was under Kenney?
I can't remember. It
was August. I think she got in May.
She got in May. So then my next question was,
I think we started Ingram in December of 2020. I think the real impetus, or November of 2020, what really triggered everybody with the start of Ingram for me was all those stupid orders that were telling us how many friends we were allowed to have in our homes over Christmas.
Yeah, and so what I was going to ask is, immediately after the Ingram decision, was there a brief talk about some compensation? Like, can you tell us behind closed door, what was the government's initial reaction when they lost the Ingram case?
Well, the administrative state was horrified, right? So all the bureaucrats were horrified. All the Kennyites were hiding under their desks, right? And obviously there were a lot of people within the government that wanted that case appealed. My understanding is, to Danielle's credit, she was the one that put her foot down and said, no, we need to deal with this. We're not appealing this decision, right? So I give her a lot of credit for that.
But then fast forward to today, she doesn't seem like that's why I was asking the question. If she was really, why did she not just offer up some compensation right there and then?
Yeah, I'm still cautiously optimistic. I mean, I have, I think she has a really tough job. Let's be clear. She's constantly being stabbed in the back by her own party. She's, now she has, Nenshi to contend with, right? So, what we keep saying, or what I keep encouraging Danielle Smith to internalize, is the fact that, there are way more Albertans on our side of this argument than on the other. But nobody wants to give credit to that. Like, let's just look at the current vaccine statistics as an example. Like, only 16% of Albertans are still getting COVID shots. And it's less than 6% of kids now that are being vaccinated with the COVID shots. What does that tell you? It tells you that most Albertans have figured out that this is all bullshit. Right. And they're voting with their feet, and they're not going, and I love it now too, because every time I run into, some of the more obnoxious people that were touting the vaccines during during COVID, and calling me all kinds of names, including anti-vaxxer and all the rest of it. It's like, I just love asking them whether they're up to date on all of their boosters. It's like, have you had your 12 boosters yet? Oh my goodness, you haven't had your 12 shots? You're an anti-vaxxer. You're going to kill my grandmother. How could you? Right? Like, that's what, that's how stupid this has all become, right?
So Christy in chat's asked a question. I'm going to actually expand on it. She says, if we're successful, or if you're successful with this class action, where's the money going to come from? But in addition to that, where did the original $13 billion come from? Is that money we got back from the feds, or?
Well, no, that obviously came out of Alberta tax revenues, right?
Yeah, and that's a point I saw that come up, and Jeff, maybe you'll probably have something to add, but all money the government spends is taxpayer money. Like, I want to make that so clear. Look at how many billions of dollars constantly goes unaccounted for on arrive, can, scam, whatever you want to call it. You see money just disappearing. And then when we're talking about compensating individual private citizens that were harmed, people are asking that question. And I've tried to get people to go back to ask where that public money is going, because that's the bigger question, not when there's already harms that were caused. They're going to have to find that money if they were liable. And again, it's all of our money in the end, every cent that they spend. And that's why I'm going back to the brief and the evidence we have. They gave us evidence that they spent $13 billion to the public sector, and through 5% at private businesses. So they were able to come up with that kind of money, or who knows what exactly.
What did
So,
they? What would the private or what would the public sector even need? Like,
you see it in there, like it's in the evidence, but it was bonkers. It said stuff like site rehabilitation. There was even irrigation services, a lot to municipalities, $1 billion. And that's just like on the, the heading. I don't know what subheading. So
A lot of really fancy, really
Yeah.
fancy and expensive plexiglass screens, I'm sure.
yeah,
like, exactly, what did it go for? Who knows?
fancy computers so that
yeah,
civil
fancy
servants could work
computers
from
so all
home
the
is what it was.
Yeah,
Lots of fancy computers.
so that
Yeah.
all the senior
Computers.
bureaucrats could work at home, right?
Wow.
But something I've been
That's the
pitching
question.
and I know a lot of people bring this up, so I'd like to address it head on. And that is, well, we don't want to see the Alberta taxpayers having to pay for this, right? Well, first of all, right, according to the government, it was the Alberta taxpayers that were benefiting from the lockdowns in the first place at the expense of small businesses in this province. So just as a general proposition, I ask, on what planet should society, should a small group of society be forced to suffer for the benefit of society as a whole without society as a whole compensating that small group of people that are being forced to suffer, right? That's my first point. The second point is, I think that, it's loud and clear, and Danielle has not done enough on this. We had a referendum in this province that directed the Alberta government to end transfer payments once and for all. There's no constitutional reason for the transfer payments. The language in and around equalization in the Constitution is the vaguest and wishy-washiest language of any portion of the Constitution. Alberta should bring an end to it, and all of the damages suffered by Alberta businesses because idiots in the Alberta government were following the direction of idiots in the federal government, then all of that money should come out of equalization and just keep that money at home rather than sending it to Quebec and sending it to the other so-called have-not provinces, in this country. It's time for Alberta to say, no, charity begins at home, and we have things that we need to do, to straighten out our own house and a lot of messes that were created by the federal government, and the federal government telling us that we, encouraging, the public health officials in Alberta to shut down businesses as a legitimate response to an airborne pathogen that wasn't going to be stopped regardless of whatever measures brought in.
As a taxpayer, I've talked about this as well, and as a taxpayer, I have no problem. It's going to cost me to compensate the people, and I have no problem paying for that. It'd be an easier pill to swallow if a few politicians were held accountable. I mean, that's my long-term goal in all of this. I mean, these are all dominoes that fall. I'm glad, the mandates were illegal. Now there's a consequence to politicians. Maybe this crop of politician won't pay, but hopefully it makes future politicians think twice about, some of these actions.
Well, I still think, good on Calgarians for throwing out Tyler Shandro and Jason Copping, right? And everybody should be reminded. Mickey Amory, he was in the COVID cabinet. Our present health minister was in the COVID cabinet. All of the people that were part of the Kenny Cocktail cabinet. A list should be posted somewhere, and everybody should be reminded during the next provincial election to either to go out and actively support nomination challenges in their, in their constituencies, or if they somehow end up, getting through so that they can, that they can be the candidate the same way Nixon was stuffed down people's throats I've lost the name of the constituency now, but the constituency west of Red Deer, Rocky Mountain House, in the same way Nixon was forced down people's throats in Rocky Mountain House. People should just stay home and not vote for him. We need to get these people out of government. I guess next time around, we need to be very careful that Nenshi isn't elected. But if there are enough rural votes to carry the day the same way there were last time, there should, people need to be thinking really carefully and voting, deciding whether or not they want to be voting for people that cause this kind of harm.
Then she had a fundraiser in Lethbridge yesterday, and he had 50 blue-haired people come out to his fundraiser. So I'm not too worried about Nenshi right now. So hey, did I read somewhere that Shandro somehow or other came back into government, similar to what Redford did? Like, did Danielle give him another patronage appointment? I got to look into that. I heard Shandro's back. I hope that's wrong.
I'm not 100% sure. Yeah.
That's more than nauseating if that's true.
Jeff, when we first talked, I think it was through a Zoom call, and I'm not sure if it was late 2021 or early 2022, and you kind of laid out a path on these things. They'd start off on a civic level, which was fighting the tickets and the mandates. It would move to a class action before it would get into criminality. Do you still see that these cases inside of either on a provincial level or on a federal level we will see some arrests under these things? Like, do we have any hope on that? Or
no? I think that the odds of that happening are slim to none, frankly. Right? If you're talking about bureaucrats being charged criminally or civilly, right, or criminally, probably. Without a massive change in government, I can't see that happening. The administrative state is just too powerful. Like, I think what we need to do is we need to look at reforming our statutes to strip power away from the administrative state. And we need to start passing laws that take power away from the courts to take judicial notice of facts, supportive of government positions, and rewrite the rules in and around administrative law such that the government and the administrative state don't win 99.9% of the time, right? I've written quite a bit on this, and a lot of my testimony actually at NCI was about the need for to try to talk Danielle Smith into legislating both the Vavlov decision and the Doré decision at the Supreme Court out of existence, because basically those cases taken together say that as long as there's an emergency and a government bureaucrat says that whatever they're doing is for bona fide emergency purposes, it's not for a judge to second guess that bureaucrat the minute they use the word emergency, right? That type of judge-made law needs to be legislated out of existence. And every one of these cases needs to be litigated, on an even playing field, with the onus of proof when it comes to restrictions on rights. The onus of proof should lie on the government, not on the citizen. And that can all be done legislatively. And unfortunately, there's been no movement on that. Even that vaunted panel of, I actually sent all of those recommendations to Preston Manning and his group that were supposed to be coming up with recommendations. And, nothing like that showed up anywhere in the material.
That was a total waste of $1 million. Doesn't the Oakes test actually give us a little bit of relief for when chartered rights are being suspended?
Yeah, but we saw how. But part of that too is, I was saying is, that we need to make an amendment to the Interpretation Act to force judges in effect to apply the Oakes test strictly and to limit the ability of judges to listen to any arguments from government on, under the, fair, reasonable and a free and democratic society provision of the charter. Because what we argued, and of course Justice Romaine ignored us, but what I was arguing in Ingram with regard to, the charter and Oaks was that, first of all, the government shouldn't be allowed to argue any restrictions on rights unless and until they invoke the notwithstanding clause, right? So if a government wants to opt out of the Constitution, my view is the government should have to do it legislatively by invoking the notwithstanding clause, as opposed to simply saying, "Oh, sorry, citizen, those restrictions were, reasonable in a free and democratic society," which the judges hear the word reasonable, and it's kind of like a Pavlovian trigger for them, going, "Oh, reasonable. That's like administrative law, reasonable. That means the bureaucrats are always right and the citizens always wrong." That's what reasonable means to a judge, right? So, we need to legislate that out of existence. And the judges need to be told clearly and unequivocally that, the charter rights are damn near absolute. And the only way around them for a government that wants to pass a law, that infringes on those rights is, through invoking, passing actual legislation to invoke a notwithstanding clause. Because then at least the government has to be held, held liable politically at the ballot box. And it's not done sort of in the shadows and behind the scenes and in a courtroom somewhere where everybody doesn't necessarily hear about it, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that's where I come down on that stuff.
Yeah.
We need to, in Canada, force our judges through legislation to understand that our rights under the Charter are exactly the same as American rights under the American Constitution, which is that those rights are granted by God, not government, and they're inalienable. And inalienable means exactly that. They can't be taken away by government. And if a government tries to, whatever procedure they do it by has to be extremely robust, and, damages and compensation should follow. That's where I come down on, that's where I come
or
down
should
on
at least
stuff.
be outlined as a part of the package. I mean, they went through going back into this, they went ahead and just imposed things for the sake of imposing. There was never any science behind this. The circles around washing your hands every 6 feet, plexiglass, arrows on floors. There was never anything about that. But I mean, when these things are taken into consideration, if they are going to have an impact on people or businesses, as we're seeing, there should be some sort of an appreciation or a valuation that's assigned to what impacts will this have? Will it be finances? Will it be health impacts? Because we've seen a lot of people, like you mentioned, commit suicide because they'd lost their businesses or their homes or their livelihoods. So there should be more attached to it. Sorry, Evan,
it was despicable. And I mean, I think I've said this a number of times before, but one of the most shocking things to me during the Ingram case was when I cross-examined Dina Hinshaw, and I asked her as Chief Medical Officer of Health if she knew how many people committed suicide because of her orders. And she said, "No, and that's not for me to determine. That's for the Chief Medical Examiner." So then I said, "So as the Chief Medical Officer of Health, did you ask the Chief Medical Examiner how many people committed suicide because of your orders?" "No." Right? So, I mean, it's just this, nobody cared. They knew they were killing people. They knew their people were committing suicide, but they didn't care. Like, that's how deep, as far as I'm concerned, the communist ideology of all of those lockdown orders ran in this country. Like, they didn't care that they were killing people with them. It didn't matter. It was the ideology was what was important.
Yeah, and actually, that's the point I was going to make. I wanted to get this in, not sure how long you wanted to go, but the fear. And so the economists that the province retained and that gave evidence was when Jeff was asking, can you assess, what the damages would be depending on, and he's like, well, there was a lot of fear. And even before the lockdown orders were in place, people weren't really going out as much as they were going. And then Jeff asked, who created the fear? And he acknowledged it was the government. So, they're using psychological weapons as well against people. And then saying, well, it was that their fault that they didn't leave, their fault that they died or couldn't, go and run their business or anything, or just act normally, because nobody was acting normally, because they instilled the fear of a virus into everyone, and nobody knew what was going on. Nobody knew how to act. But you can't then, say that you're not responsible for that when you created the problem to begin with.
Yeah,
And that goes back to Marty, what you were saying when you said Wuhan. I remembered I was looking at Dr. Tam's information right at the start of this. She said you can only quarantine at the point of infection, aka Wuhan. That was her what she was saying publicly, early February, March. And then 3 years later, we're still open, shut, open, shut. Nobody knew what was going on.
It's worse than that, because it's not only did the fear and did they create it, but then the media didn't talk about anyone else other than what they had. So there's lots of people who knew what was going on, because by now we've heard from lots of them, and they were shut down, they were silenced, they were removed from platforms, on and on and on this went. So it's actually way worse than just creating the fear. It's creating the fear and then not acknowledging anything else. Yeah. And all these experts and these different doctors and these different people from across not only Canada, but North America and across the planet were trying to scream as loud as they could. And as they did, they were censored out of existence. And we all witnessed that. And so it's worse than just creating the fear. They created the fear and then they managed it into this perpetual oblivion until, somebody said earlier they thought maybe Russia-Ukraine war is what started to end it. And I would argue there's no way. The thing that ended it here in Canada is simple: Ottawa. And, when it comes to how they ended Ottawa, we're still seeing the ramifications that here in Alberta. And I might throw in a plug for the Coots 4, who 2 of them are still sitting in remand, and they're appealing that. So there's a lot of things going on here in Alberta that are not on the up and up, that look pretty darn shady. And if we're going to go back all the way through it, I won't sit and go, well, maybe this and that, and, because after the amount of interviews, and, I've had every one of you on the podcast, there is too much evidence, damning evidence, to show that we may have got swept up in the fear. But, what media did, and on and on and on this went, it's way worse than that. And I won't, at this point, I don't think there's any point in saying it any other way.
Yeah, well, I mean, just think of other things, like just think of Fistman, right? Like the book came out, right? Fistman's Fraud. I mean, and people are ignoring that. I'm like, wow, like it was genuine fraud. Like the guy basically made fake data to make a model that showed that things are going to get out of control. Immediately his model didn't match, or immediately real world didn't match his model. It's like, oh, well, that's okay, blah, blah, blah. And the governments just went along with his lie and used it to justify bad policies. I mean, yeah, it's...
Oh, God, well, look at little Timmy Caulfield and his Order of Canada, for God's sake.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing more nauseating than that. His big, one of the biggest misinformationists in Canada, who's constantly lying about COVID, gets an Order of Canada supposedly for fighting misinformation. I mean,
I'm still waiting for Tam to get her Order of Canada. I think Tam will get one. I'm still waiting for Tam to get her Order of Canada, or appointment to the Senate, like Charles Adler. But now let's not.
Well, and Caulfield was paid $1.4 million to promote messaging on social media.
Oh, it's multi-millions of dollars when you look at all the money that he's got his little sticky fingers on, right? It's just bizarre. And I mean, and some of the stuff that that he's come out with is just patently false. Like when he was attacking all the people in and around that injection of truth thing, there's absolutely no, so those words, absolutely no evidence that these vaccines have caused any harms. So we have a client whose the entire left side of her body is paralyzed, and she has an acknowledged vaccine injury. The government of Canada has put $40 million into a vaccine injury compensation program. So they're acknowledging that the vaccines are harming people. But little Timmy Caulfield, absolutely no evidence that the vaccines are causing harm. But look, there's some dangerous misinformation. Like, you can't make this stuff up. And it's like, and they're still doing it. They're all just, every chance they get, running around, making up misinformation while screaming and pointing fingers at other people, accusing them of misinformation. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It is the world
Yeah,
of today.
Caulfield only advanced past round 1 of Golden Pup's worst COVIDian contest. So the results are up, folks. Go see who won. It's no surprise, right? It's not. He's going to push it further now. He's going to do a battle between the 4 different segments. I'm pretty sure Trudeau's going to come out on top as worst COVIDian, and I think actually, when we talk about all this and all the insanity of COVID, I think Canada would come out on top, on the world stage. You put up our response to COVID. We were bigger COVIDiots than I dare say New Zealand and Australia, and they were way up there too.
Well, so. I'd like to know on a per capita basis how much debt both of those countries have taken on, right? Because Trudeau basically, under the guise of COVID, tripled or not tripled, has taken our national debt to somewhere north of $3 trillion. I mean,
he added 60% to our debt. I mean, for the 60% of the debt accumulated by Canada in the last 157 years was accumulated in 8 years by Trudeau. So it's a staggering number. Staggering.
Well, and apparently I saw something from CBC the other day. So, and I'm not sure what's going on there that CBC would say anything anything less than complimentary about their Lord and Master. But there was an article the other day saying that apparently the amount of hidden debt that Canada has is staggering, because it's, the amounts being reported apparently are just the tip of the iceberg, and the real debt that Canada's incurred is way, way higher than what's being reported. So I haven't had a chance to dig into that yet, but I certainly am planning to.
What's on all the promissory notes that he's written to other countries? I mean, there's money that we've spent, but then there's all the promises that he's made on, or commitments that he's made to other countries, that I think is where you're talking about this hidden money, right, Jeff?
The miscellaneous transfers in the federal budget, it's literally a category. It's called miscellaneous transfers, and this year it's $90 billion. Like,
wow.
That's just slush fund. That's just play money. $90 billion.
There were miscellaneous categories in this evidence too, but it was like $0.6 billion 1 year during the COVID miscellaneous spending. So miscellaneous was more than what they gave businesses.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of politicians or senior bureaucrats still trying to do a good job. One that comes to mind is the chief parliamentary budget officer. That poor guy still, he tries, but he gets shut down, and he takes his job seriously. And yeah, that's one of the things he said many, many times. He's like, the accounting is so bad. The Auditor General said it too, or not the Auditor. Yeah, the Auditor General.
He did. Yeah.
The accounting is so bad. I can't even comment.
Well, you gotta think that a lot of that's intentional, right? I think, because again, like, it's just a shell game, right? Let's just keep hiding the money. And look, here's this little pot here, and look, there's $90 billion. It's like, lift up the shell and there's your prize, right? So yeah, it's quite a it's.
So we only ever talked about one of your class actions after all of this.
Well, but I thought the purpose of this today was to talk about the business class action.
I suppose, yeah. We were gonna talk a little bit about the other one, but yeah, I suppose we covered the big one.
No, but take a couple minutes and talk about the other one, because you had mentioned Kerry Sakamoto earlier, and that was like the intro to it. We've got about 15 more minutes left to go, so a quick introduction. And again, I want to make sure that everybody is familiar with the 2 cases that are going on inside of the province, that they are specific to the province, and to make sure that if, no matter how big or small their business is, if they've suffered some losses, to make sure that they, fill out the forms, and I'll provide the links again, or as well as if they've been impacted by the jabs, that they get at least somebody out there representing them as a part of the second class action. So take a couple of minutes, and you know what? I'd love to assemble this same group together to talk about the second class action once you get your brief filed on that one as well, if you guys are game on that. But go on and talk about that one, where you're at with the process, and when you expect to have something in front of the province.
Sure, I'll get Evan to carry most of the ball on this, but just by way of introduction to it, what we're trying to do with the vaccine class action is to move that action forward in, as an efficient and quick a manner as possible. So we're trying to keep it focused on the key issues and the things that we think are going to be the easiest to prove and the hardest for the government to disapprove, right? Or to disprove. So one of the things that we're focusing on is all the government misinformation. So, specifically, all of the negligent misstatements made by government about the vaccines being safe, the vaccines being effective, all of the coercive mandates, etc. So what we're saying is that there's sort of a two-pronged approach that they took. On one hand, and again, this goes to, Bonnie Henry was the chair of the committee, but you had, Teresa Tam, Bonnie Henry, Dina Hinshaw, all of the chief medical officers of health, would get together and they'd talk about how they're going to fight vaccine hesitancy. And what they were really saying is, how are we going to hide all of the bad information about the vaccines from the public so that people will still go out and get vaccinated, notwithstanding how bad these vaccines are and how dangerous these vaccines are, even according to, to the data directly from the vaccine companies themselves, right? So what we say about that is that, and keep in mind, we're not suing Bonnie Henry, we're not suing every CMOH, but we are suing Alberta because we say that they're part of this conspiracy with the federal government to hide information from the general public about the lack of safety of these vaccines, right, in a manner that took away the ability of any member of the public who is vaccinated to have provided informed consent to the shot. Okay. And what that means, if you look at, going back to the old Morgentaler decision and some of the cases in and around medical consent, right? It's pretty clear that if you are given a medical procedure, right, without having been fully informed as to, the actual harms that this procedure could cause, right, you haven't provided your consent. And a lack of consent to a medical procedure like a vaccine is in fact an assault, right? Doctors, and that's why you have to sign, these informed consent forms. Well, what we've been seeing all, across Alberta, and certainly Carrie Sakamoto and her husband have documented all of this very well in their file. I mean, they got, you could have some little mild redness at the injection site. Oh, you might have a little bit of a sore arm. Oh, you could have a little bit of fever and chills. But nowhere was anybody told, but if you get this vaccine, you could also have severe neurological impairment, be paralyzed, your entire body, or half of your body. You'd have Bell's palsy. You could have any number of autoimmune disorders. On and on and on. Or up to and including death. If you get this shot, you could die. Nobody was ever told that ever with regard to these shots. And all the government messaging was safe and effective. Oh, no, these shots are so safe and they are so effective. Go get these shots, safe and effective, safe and effective. And they knew full well that the data coming out of even Pfizer early on was anything but. They also, at the Canada level, knew full well that Pfizer specifically refused to warrant these vaccines for safety. So they wouldn't provide any warranty for safety. The vaccine contracts themselves, we believe, say that the vaccines, Pfizer, specifically states the vaccines were rushed to market without adequate emergency or without adequate vaccine testing being done. They were only being put forward on an emergency use only basis, and that any liability for any damages that accrue from these vaccines lies solely, with the governments, et cetera. So how many people do you think would have gotten a shot if they knew that the vaccine companies themselves wouldn't even guarantee that they were safe? Right. And then with regard to the kids shots, especially, the government knew, because, well, I know they knew, both Alberta and Canada, because I sent them copies, Trudeau, Tam, Henshaw, Kenny, all of them, copies of Table 14 of the Pfizer EUA application, which demonstrated that in children, the children were more likely to die from the vaccine than they were to die from COVID. And all of that was kept from the public, right? The other thing that was kept from the public is it's a well-known side effect of these vaccines. RSV is a well-known side effect of these viruses, of these vaccines. So if you get the Pfizer COVID vaccine, you're literally 4 times more likely to contract RSV than you would be if you weren't vaccinated, right? So RSV is like, and I can't remember the exact number. I think it's something like 600. I have to go back and look at my own notes, and I wrote a Substack on it. But it's like you're literally, I think 6 times more likely as a child to die, or 600 times more likely to die from RSV if you're a child than you are to die from COVID, or the numbers. So what parent is told, hey, give your kid this wonderful new shot, but just know that if you give your kid this shot, they're going to be 4 times more likely to contract an illness that's 600 times more likely to kill them, right? None of that was told to anyone, right? And then on top of it, I mean, they're still pushing these shots on the public. The Cleveland Clinic has now come out with this huge study of 59,000 Cleveland Clinic employees with a very robust control group, in excess of 10,000 Cleveland Clinic employees who were not vaccinated. And this study demonstrates that the more vaccines you get, the more likely you are to contract COVID, be hospitalized with COVID, to die from COVID, and generally have worse health outcomes with every extra shot you get. So that study's out there. It's well known, and the government isn't disclosing that to anybody, and they're still pushing the shots. So what we're saying is that the government's, first of all, are negligent in allowing these shots to roll out in the first place, and second of all, have literally conspired to commit assault on the entire Canadian population, and this lawsuit, the Alberta population, by hiding pertinent information with regard to how unsafe the vaccines are from the citizens of Alberta under this plan to fight vaccine hesitancy. So in other words, under the guise of vaccine hesitancy, doctors, Hinshaw, Henry, and others, right, were literally conspiring to keep patients from being able to provide informed consent with regard to these shots as part of their vaccine rollout plan. And that's part of our lawsuit. With that, I'll turn it over to Eva.
Let me ask you just a quick couple of qualifying questions on here. So there's already a VISP vaccine injury support program inside of Canada. Why wouldn't we be going after this on a federal thing? Or is it because of the doctors in Alberta pushed it through provincial health?
Well, we're suing Alberta as well as Canada, because of all of the frankly negligent, stupid things that Dina Hinshaw was seen to do while she was the CMOH. Like, repeatedly telling people how safe the vaccines were when she knew they weren't. Standing up on the eve of, child vaccine rollout announcements to lie about children who died from COVID when they hadn't died from COVID. They died from, either, birth abnormalities or stage 4 cancer, right? Are the two notorious ones that stand out, with Hinshaw. And then my favorite of all, and this is what, harmed Carrie Sakamoto, was Hinshaw's miraculous vaccine buffet. So she's telling people that took AstraZeneca that, it's perfectly safe and effective, to get another vaccine on top of one that's already been discontinued for being too dangerous for human consumption. So, so Carrie followed Hinshaw's advice. She had the AstraZeneca because the first shot is the best shot, another slogan. And then immediately following the Pfizer shot, she then became extremely ill. Well, that's all pursuant to Hinshaw's medical advice. So that's the big reason we're suing Alberta is because because of Hinshaw's negligence.
I think, Sheldon, to your question, though, you were asking why not go to the program, but the program is administered on a one, like per person basis. It's like going for a compensation board assessment. That's kind of how it's set up from what I've heard. So and that's not a government, that's an administrative body. So the way that you would sue that, I couldn't even imagine like what kind of tort we would bring it or like action against that body. So what Jeff was describing is the causes of action that we've created in this class act or in the statement of claim that goes against the federal government and the provincial government for conspiring, for negligent misrepresentation, for negligence just in general, for abuse of power. So that's how you that's the direct line to the government rather than that third body board that they created. But I think that was your question. I hope that explained.
That's exactly it. I just wanted to make sure that we're going after the feds here, not just the province.
Yes,
they're co-defendants for sure.
Okay.
And so I did mention this at the beginning, is that we actually have asked the federal government lawyers to provide unredacted contracts of the vaccine, because our whole argument is that they knew that it was not safe and effective, because that's what the vaccine contract said. Yet they went around and told the public that it was safe and effective. And they said, how is it relevant for you to have the vaccine contracts? So we have
the vaccine contracts. That's the other thing. The vaccine contracts themselves state that Pfizer doesn't warrant the Pfizer vaccine for effectiveness at stopping the transmission of COVID, as an example, right? So, and the Pfizer contract itself says we don't guarantee that the product is safe. So, if Pfizer contractually is telling the government of Alberta, of Canada, that the vaccines, they will not warrant the vaccines as being either safe or effective, then how the hell can the government of Canada repeatedly tell everybody that that the vaccines are safe and effective, and if you don't get them, we're going to strip you of your civil rights, which is the situation we ended up in.
I don't think you're going to get that contract. I mean, I've seen Anthony Housefather talk about it in committee, and there's a reason why the contracts are confidential and redacted, but good luck. I hope you do, because man, the contracts in and of themselves are damaging for sure.
We should have another podcast when we put in our application for that, because I have some ideas of how I'm going to make it very compelling to the court to have to produce that.
Oh, good.
Anyway, I won't give it up now. No,
don't give it up. Yeah.
So a second question on what you'd said there, Jeff, is that when you'd stated that without signing proper consent, it is an actual assault charge, or a doctor is committing assault. But we can't go after the province.
I'm not saying in a criminal context. I'm saying in a civil context, right? Okay. So it amounts to it's civil law to the tort of assault.
Yeah. But you're suing the province. You're not suing the health board, or are you suing the province because of the agent?
The province of Alberta and the government of Canada.
Because of AH, because of they were the ones injecting it.
Yeah.
But more than that, it was the province and Canada that were the ones that were controlling the messaging, right? They were working together to create the messaging, and they were the ones that were standing up at the podiums, whether it was Theresa Tam or Dina Hinshaw, right? For whom the federal government and provincial government are liable, right? They were the ones standing up, giving all the negligent advice, and they were the ones that were telling people that, oh, we're your doctors, listen to us, safe and effective. Oh, first shot's the best shot. What were some of the other ones?
Run. I heard them say, run to the pharmacy to get your shot.
Yeah, just all of those stupid slogans that they come up with every week or two.
They offered Visa cards in Alberta. Like they offered a preloaded $100 Visa card.
They had a $1 million lottery in Alberta.
Yeah, they had a lottery. They had 3 winners apparently of the lottery. Yeah, God.
they're not alive anymore, but they.
I missed that. That sounds a lot like.
Oh, you don't remember that? No, there was a genuinely three people were drawn apparently, and got $1 million each.
I had conversations with people that I was working with at the time that said, "Man, I wish I'd really waited so I could have been on the $1 million lottery."
Oh
and
my God.
And so you're just like, yes,
Oh,
there was a lot
yeah,
of different marketing campaigns.
I remember that. That's when Jason Kenney tried to turn Alberta into Pan Am.
Well, I mean, if you want, I got a lot of screenshots, and I saved some of that advertising. Some of the Alberta advertising was absolutely disgusting. Like, you know, the needles with the little children in it being like, man, there was some really brutal advertising. No, I'll put some up tomorrow.
More importantly,
Yeah.
you know, it's not, you know, the methods that they use to encourage people to get vaccinated. The things that we're focusing on are the steps they took to keep information from the public, right? So that the public wouldn't be fully informed, you know, including the campaigns against all of us. You know, that anybody that speaks out against this stuff is deplatformed. Anybody that anybody that says anything critical of the vaccine.
Me and Sheldon can speak to this one very personally. I mean, I was publishing information that was showing the harmful effects of the vaccine. And then on July 22nd, 2022, or July 12th, 2022, the government stopped publishing the data that we were using to show that the vaccine was hurting people. And then I wrote letters. I went as far as I stopped at a freedom of information request because I knew I wouldn't get anything anyways, but the government suppressed the data. There was plenty of evidence. Alberta had some great data, and it was showing clearly that, because Alberta used to cross-reference COVID cases, hospital admissions, ICU admissions, and deaths, cross-reference against 1, 2, 3, or 4 doses. And so we could plot all that data and go, holy shit, man. You know, 86% of the people are in hospital are vaccinated. Like, yeah. I don't know how much.
Well, that data, just all it did was it basically showed exactly what the Cleveland Clinic study ended up proving. Right. Yeah. The one that really tore it for me was remember the rainbow graphs, right? So you had those graphs that had the big death spikes in the senior citizens, you know, between days 5 and 8 of getting a shot, either 1 shot or 2 shots. Between days 5 and 8, there's this huge spike in deaths, in the senior citizen population, right? So there seemed to be this fairly strong correlation between, being vaccinated and people with, weaker physiologies being killed by the vaccines, right? So and I'm trying to remember now. I think it was an American journalist that brought it to the world's attention. Can't remember who it was now. One of you gentlemen probably do. But anyway, when it was brought to the world's attention that this is what this Alberta data was demonstrating. I mean, what was the Alberta government or AHS's reaction to this? It wasn't to say, "Oh my goodness, we better investigate this," because when you have a correlation that's that strong, that merits investigation. No, their reaction was to simply hide the data.
That's actually interesting.
Let's scrub the internet and make sure that nobody can find this anymore, because we don't like the fact that this, that this data correlation is now out in the public sphere.
Yeah, no, other jurisdictions zoomed in on Alberta's data and made changes to their COVID schedules, their vaccine schedules based on our data. It's incredible that other places looked at our data and said, shit, we better stop injecting this. And we who own, and like, wow, yeah, I don't even want to go there. That's too disturbing for me. Now I'm getting PTSD.
What they actually replaced the rainbow graph, or I call it the heat graph, and me and Marty had talked about that several times before it went, before it really blew up. Excuse me. Is they put the vaccines on one page, and then they put the impacts blended on a following page. So what you could actually see is every time that they would push a wave of vaccinations, it would drive a wave of hospitalizations. You could see it as clear as day, and they even had it as the 14 days. The inside of the 14-day window.
Right.
You could see how the hospitalizations and ICU admissions spiked at the exact same time. Like it followed the complete path, and it did that with each one of the vaccinations. So
yeah, everybody always says correlation does not equal causation. I'm like, I agree, but yeah, you're right. I mean that the waves of cases and hospitalization that followed every vaccine campaign was undeniable. It was incredible.
I love that little slogan, correlation doesn't equal causation, right? Because it's like, well, wait a minute, right? Correlation doesn't equal causation. But you would agree with me, you would agree with me, wouldn't you, sir, that in some cases correlation may equate to causation, right? And then wouldn't you further agree with me, sir, that in a case of a strong correlation merits investigation?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
But no. Correlation doesn't merit investigation. Correlation merits a cover-up, which is what we're dealing with.
Well, they said people that didn't die from COVID that were vaccinated, that's not correlation or causation or correlation equals causation. The jab saved everybody. Right? But when you say, well, no, they drove waves of cases, hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and mortality, they say, no, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
And the government was pushing this completely false information and misinformation. They were even pushing this on the courts. Like they actually got, it was Sir Michael Houghton, who's a Nobel laureate, right? Who at the time was I think the chairman of the Li Ka-shing Institute of Virology at the University of Alberta. I refer to it as the Li Ka-ching Institute, but it's it's basically just a money-making endeavor that these people are involved in. And they got this Nobel laureate, Michael Houghton, to file an affidavit saying, oh, well, we have to force people to get vaccinated, and we need to fire doctors and nurses that don't get vaccinated, because if everybody in the world won't get vaccinated, we'll never stop the pandemic. And the pandemic will only end when everybody in the world is vaccinated. So this is their Nobel laureate pushing completely phony science, right? Yeah. And this phony theory they came up with the big reason for forcing people to be vaccinated against their will is because you're never going to end COVID unless everybody in the world is injected with a vaccine that doesn't stop COVID. Right? I mean, this is the kind of crap that we were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And part of, what I consider to be the phony narrative that was developed by the government to force people to be vaccinated without informed consent, without giving informed consent.
Guys, you know what? It's we're at about the 2-hour mark here, and I appreciate the time. I know you're a couple hours ahead of us here, Jeff. So I think we could probably cut her off there. But I want to say to all of you, Sean, Marty, Jeff, Eva, hey, thanks for coming out, making people aware of what you guys are working on. Again, I think it's a huge and important conversation. Looks like we've got about 3,000, about 3,300 people that'll hopefully share the message. We'll see these things cycled through and re-seen again. I hope that, this gets you a lot more people on board, on deck with this, so that they can, seek a little bit of compensation for the pains and suffering that they've been caused. And again, when you guys get together for the next brief for going for the vaccine injury class action, definitely let's get together again, have another chat about it. Final words.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jeff.
Thanks for the invite, Zach Yak, for bringing us on.
Yeah, that was great.
That was great.
Now I got to go read that brief.
Yes.
No, you do. It's only 55 pages.
I started reading it. I started last week, and then I got distracted.
Everybody read the brief. I'll post it again tomorrow on the wrap.
I'm like Jeff. I used to fly all the time, and when I flew, that was like 4 hours to sit and read a book or something. I don't fly. I haven't flown. Actually, I flew to Mexico this year. It was the first time in 5 years I stepped on a plane. I thought I was going to get stopped at the border. I actually made it through. But
all right. Have a great night, everybody.
Cheers,
Good
everyone.
night, everyone.
Thanks, guys.